What's up, guys? It is Dr. Seth, and today we are answering your questions. I put up an Instagram AMA while I was doing cardio, gave it some time to let some good ones accumulate, so let's get into her. And I figure might as well keep her interesting by starting out with some butt stuff. Question 1. Weak glute. How to strengthen? And yes, that is in fact how he spelled weak. And this question is one that I would normally not touch at all because it is less of a question and more of a statement, and there isn't a lot of context to go with it. But I had a bunch of hip glute questions come in, and this was the funniest one to put on the screen, so it is what I went with, and I will shed some light onto some potential stuff that could be going on with it. So bottom line, if you have a muscle anywhere, whether it is a glute or not a glute, whether it's a glute, a delta, pec, a bicep, whatever, and it isn't contracting well, it's weak, it's not doing what it's supposed to do, the simplest thing that we can do is find a way to train it so that we can bring it up over time. And if it isn't contracting well, if it isn't working well, in the case of a glute, just doing more squats and deadlifts, if it ain't working, that might not be the best place to start, because if it ain't working, just doing more work that isn't getting it to work probably isn't going to get it to work. So what we can do is regress the movement back to the point where we can actually get the thing to do something and then build up from there. With a glute, what we could start with is something like a single leg glute bridge, maybe even a bilateral glute bridge if you're having that much trouble. Progress that towards some hip thrust, progress that towards a single leg RDL, progress that towards a split squat or even a bilateral RDL, and then progress that towards goblet squats, real squats, deadlifts, so on and so forth. What matters is that you start with something that you can get the glute to work with and then build up over time. And if you want to look a little bit deeper, if you want to potentially have a more efficient time solving the problem, what we can do is ask, why isn't the glute working? Why is there something going on that is causing the glute to be weak? Why is there something causing the glute to not contract well? And if that glute is inhibited for some reason, sometimes that might be pain or injury causing some sort of neurological inhibition. Other times it might be if the brain senses that we lack control or lack range of motion, it's going to slow things down a little bit to try to keep the area safe. If it is pain or injury causing the inhibition, best thing to do is just slowly build tolerance, slowly progress up load, and things should start working better. We might need to do stuff specific to the pain or injury, but it's hard to say what to do if I don't know what is going on. If it is a lack of range of motion access, lack of range of motion control, contributing to inhibition, with a glute, the big things I'd be looking at are going to be your ability to extend the hip fully. If you lack full extension, you can't get to full extension, that glute isn't going to work super well trying to create force into full extension. The other thing I'm going to look at is whether or not we lack hip internal rotation. Because if we lack hip internal rotation, we're not going to have that arthrokinematic slide glide roll that's going to let the femur go where it needs to go when we are flexing and extending the hip. And if we lack that, the glute is going to be inhibited to some degree. So check out hip extension, check out hip internal rotation, train the glute appropriately, and it is going to catch back on. All right, on to the next one. How can I use less leg drive? How can I use less leg drive during a deadlift? And when I first read this question, it kind of confused me a little bit because I was like, what kind of circumstance would someone want less leg drive on a deadlift? And then I got to thinking, there's probably two. The first one would be if you're the power lifter that's trying to squat way too low and they're trying to squat their deadlift rather than deadlifting their deadlift. The other circumstance where someone might want less leg drive is if they're a bodybuilder trying to do a deadlift for hypertrophy purposes and they want to make sure that all of the work is going to their backside. And I'm going to start with the bodybuilder answer because that one's going to be a lot easier. If you're a bodybuilder deadlifting for hypertrophy, it might just be worth throwing out conventional deadlifts and doing stiff legs because for that purpose, they're probably going to be a little bit more effective most of the time. Now, if you're the powerlifter who's squatting up his deadlift and we want to have the right amount of leg drive, not zero leg drive, because if we're a powerlifter, we probably don't want to be stiff legging it because that's not going to be the most efficient way to get a strong deadlift. What we can do, though, is apply a concept that I like to call stiff legging your wedge. And what I mean by that is once you're on the bar, once your hands are set, once everything's locked in, I'll get people to push their hips up by flexing their quads. And from this position, what we'll do is we'll try to flex the glutes, flex the hamstrings, set the back harder, and we'll try to take the slack out of the bar by stiff legging into that tension. And once we have that stiff leg tension there, we're going to use the hamstrings to pull our knees forward. And at a certain point of the knees coming forward, you should almost feel like the leverages line up so the bar just wants to pop off the floor. And when you're at that point where the bar just wants to pop off the floor, let it pop off the floor and pull it to lockout, and that should be a pretty decent deadlift start position, and it should turn into a pretty decent deadlift for you. And the thing about leg drive in a deadlift is that leg drive in a deadlift, it's not a bad thing to put a lot of quads into your pull. For a lot of lifters that I coach, especially if they're built like me, I want as much quad into it as possible because that's going to give us the best chance of having a strong deadlift. What we don't want is to have someone built like me trying to stiff leg it, trying to posterior chain it, because my leverages ain't going to line up well for that. And in general, when we're looking at a lifter and how much leg drive they should have, what I'm trying to do is just get as much leg drive as we can have into the pull without taking away from what the posterior chain is doing. And on the inverse side, I want to have as much posterior chain into the pull as I can without taking away what is happening on the anterior chain. And I know it's popular to argue about whether deadlifts are anterior chain or posterior chain. Like people will say, it's a posterior chain dominant movement, you don't need quads at all. And those people are what I like to call dum-dums. Anyhow, on to the next one. How much raw squat work should I do if I compete in knee wraps? And what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to flip this question around and ask, how much wrapped squat work should you be doing if you need to compete in wraps? And the answer to that question should be the amount of wrapped squat work that allows you to be proficient in wraps and allows you to display strength in wraps. And once you have that much wrapped work in, I'm biased to believe that the rest of your training should be done in knee sleeves. Because if we're doing the majority of our off-season in sleeves and we're leading into the beginning of our prep in sleeves, our knees and our bottom end are going to be so freaking strong. And then when we put the wraps on and get dialed into the wraps, that support is going to give us even more pounds out of them. If we're spending all of our time in wraps, we're taking away from the stimulus that the bottom end of the squat gives us. We're making the bottom end of the squat easier. And if we just always make the bottom end of the squat easier and easier and easier, we're going to end up developing a weak point there. So I want to have enough sleeve work in that we're strong, enough wrapped work in that we can display in the wraps. And for most lifters in general, what I'd suggest is run your entire off season in knee sleeves. And when it comes time to get ready for a meet, when it comes time to peak for a meet, I would plan to have 6 to 8 wrap sessions. That should be enough to give you that proficiency. That should be enough to get your knees used to the compression. And that should be enough to get you used to having more weight on the bar. But it shouldn't be so much that we're developing any sort of weak point by becoming over-reliant on the wraps. And just like the anterior chain versus posterior chain in the deadlift, it's not that like wrap squatting is bad. It's not that sleeve squatting is bad for wrap squatting. It's like we want to have the right amount to give the lifter the best chance to do well on the platform. And the exact amount of wrap sessions the lifter needs is going to vary from lifter to lifter and circumstance to circumstance. If they're very experienced and very comfortable in wraps, I've gotten away with wrapped meets where I only spent 4 sessions in knee wraps and did pretty darn good. If a lifter is brand new to wraps, 6 to 8 sessions might not be enough to get them to the point where they're actually comfortable with using them. So try to figure out what amount you need to be good to go on meet day and run that amount. And if it doesn't work out for you, learn from it and adjust for your next meet prep. Next one, why do you program Kodiak Stew the way that you do? Well, it is a work in progress. And I don't necessarily mean that as a bad thing, because every lifter that I program for, it is always a work in progress because my programming philosophy is heavily biased towards the bottom up side of the spectrum. And what I mean by that, I'm going to steal from Mike T because how he sums it up with his emerging strategies is very elegant. But basically, the programming strategy emerges as the program takes place. So we set someone up with something relatively basic, and then we let that see what it does. And then based on seeing what it does, we adjust, we modify, we build off of that. And then eventually, 10, 15, 20 weeks down the road, it ends up being unique to the individual and unique to their needs. And with Stu, where we currently are, he finished up his last meet prep really friggin' well, and he wanted to experiment with moving towards a MED, traditional, more west sidey split, and I was okay with that based on what we developed during the last prep because his tissue tolerance was there to support it, his movement was solid enough to support it, and it would allow us to work on a couple things specific to him. Number one, having the ME work allowed us to get away from like his monkey brain getting in the way of programming because having a day where we were allowed to go heavy, it kind of got rid of the potential to overshoot quite as regularly. regularly. On the other side of things, being able to play with more variations within that split is allowing us to better target towards those weak points. One thing that we've modified away from the traditional MEDE split is that we've gotten rid of dynamic effort squats because it was becoming apparent that the DE squats were not doing shit all for him. He was able to just kind of blast through him like a wiffle ball. It wasn't creating enough tension to really give him any stimulus, whether that be on the technical side of things, whether it be on the actual strength side of things. So we swapped out the dynamic effort squat for a rep effort squat, and since making that swap, it seems to be doing very well, and I'm excited to see how it pans out. This is definitely not like the be-all, end-all of the program, but it's going to continue shaping up. We're going to continue modifying as new needs arise, and that happens with every lifter. Because if we're trying to target a weak point, if we're setting up the program to do something or target a specific aspect that we're trying to work on, if we work on that aspect for long enough, that weak point is going to become less of a weak point, and we will have to shift our focus elsewhere. So when we're programming for someone, when we are using a bottom-up strategy versus a top-down, one thing that I like to do is I like to have a roadmap of where I want things to go. Like I have the meet day that I'm targeting towards, and I kind of have a general idea of how we want to get there, but I'm not set in stone of this is the exact progression that we need. We try to make the progression suitable to the lifter. We try to select exercises suitable to what they need on that day. And then we build off of that and keep building, and keep learning as we go. And it ends up shaping up pretty well the vast majority of the time if the lifter and coach have good communication skills with each other. How should I transition to the next one?
What is the next one?
Well, yeah, but I need like a on to the next one. Like how do I introduce the next question while making it interesting that I'm going to the next question?
Just do that. This is your thing.
Okay, this is the next question. Thoughts on BPC-157 and TB500? Well, I ain't going to pretend to be some sort of pharmacology expert, so I'm going to come at this from a experiential side of things. And like, yes, there are differences with them in terms of tissue affinity. Yes, there are differences with them in terms of inflammatory effect. Yes, there are differences with them in terms of whether they're systemic or more local, but I don't want to talk about that because I am not a nerd in that regard. I really just know about how I have used them myself and what I have got from them. And for the vast majority of lifters, I actually wouldn't recommend them, even though they do tend to work. And the reason that I wouldn't recommend them is the things that lifters are trying to do with them, the problems that lifters are trying to solve. Injecting a peptide will likely make it feel better and will allow them to train harder sooner. But by injecting the peptide, the lifter then is not given the opportunity to actually fix the problem. And that problem comes back to shitty training and shitty load management. So if we take a peptide to mask shitty training and shitty load management, it's going to allow you to get past whatever shittiness you're going through. But then as soon as that peptide's gone, the shitty training and the shitty load management is still there, and you're going to be back to square one. And you're just going to end up running peptides 8 months out of the year because you can't manage your training well. So instead of just injecting something to try to make something feel better, if we were to put more effort into our prep work, so instead of just injecting something to try to make a body part feel better, if we were to put more effort into preparing to train, if we were to put more effort into actually training appropriately for what we have in the day, if we were to put more effort into actually training through ranges of motion that we suck at using, we would then not run into those problems and we wouldn't need the peptides. And that is what I would much rather see most lifters do. Now, the one case where I would say that it is worth considering using them is if you have something where there's major structure that needs to heal. So in the case of a major muscle tear like my pec, in the case of a surgery, in the case of something like that, those will absolutely speed up the healing process. We just got to remember that we can't be using them in place of good rehab because, again, if you have a muscle tear and you just peptide the shit out of it without rehabbing it, you are not going to be in a good place to continue training on it because you peptided the shit out of it. It's not ready to train yet. If you go back to training, you're likely going to just make things shittier for yourself again. So, like, yes, they do work, but most of the time they might not be the best call, especially when we consider that pain itself is a neurological phenomenon, not a structural phenomenon. So if it is something where we don't necessarily need to heal, they're not going to do much for you in the first place. So that's kind of my take on them. For a lot of lifters, I would not recommend them, and I can't really recommend them because of the legality side of them anyways, especially being on YouTube, so hopefully I don't get demonetized by this. I'm definitely saying not to do them. YouTube people that are watching this, what I am saying is that yes, they do work for improving healing, but a lot of times, it's not the healing that you need to worry about. It's worrying about managing training that will actually solve your problem, and you'd just be band-aiding it if you were to use a peptide to try to solve that problem. And I guess this is the last question that I got saved. So last question of the day, top factors that got you through a sticking point. And what we got to realize is that if you powerlift for long enough, you are going to hit a point where it feels like the whole damn thing is one big sticking point, because PRs just ain't going to come as often if you spend enough time in the sport. And that is a natural progression that isn't necessarily a bad thing. And being at this point now almost makes it more rewarding, because the PRs are so much harder to achieve and it takes so much more precision to get there. And like when I was starting out, getting past the sticking point was usually just a matter of trying harder, working harder, doing more, and things would happen. But eventually, you're going to hit a wall where just trying hard just runs you harder into that wall, and you end up getting hurt, you end up getting digged up, you end up realizing that just trying harder isn't the answer. And that's where a lot of lifters just get permanently stuck, because they're refusing to take a look at how they're trying. Because when trying hard runs out, you need to learn how to try better. That might mean putting less effort into certain aspects so that you can put more effort into the others. You might need to prioritize a certain accessory to a bigger extent. You might need to prioritize a certain movement pattern or body part to a certain extent to get past the sticking point. You might need to look at how your training looks in relation to your ability to recover. You might need to look at nutrition. You might need to look at so many things as different avenues you could put effort in to get through that sticking point. And at a certain point, trying better might run out as well, because things will slow down. And once you get to the place where things slow down, it's a matter of learning to try longer and being in it for the long game. Because as progress gets harder and harder and harder to achieve, it's going to take longer and longer and longer to get there. And you just need to be persistent in trying as best as you can until you get the outcome that we're looking for. And yes, in a way, the outcome, the PR, the big total, it still is the goal. But the realistic goal almost needs to shift from the outcome towards just the process, towards making every training session as effective as it can be, towards making every block as effective as it can be, towards making everything as effective as it can be. And if we do that for long enough, we're going to get past that. And it also comes with needing to be self-aware, because like I was talking about in the programming philosophy question, the weak points, those will change over time. Where we need to put effort in will change over time. And we need to have the ability to take an honest look at where we are in training, what we need to be putting effort towards, and shift as those needs change. So it's going to be self-awareness and persistence that are going to be the real thing that get you past those big, hard sticking points. All right, guys, that is it for today. If I didn't get to your question, just assume that it was stupid and never ask one again. I'm kidding, there were a lot and I only had so much time, and I wanted to pick the questions that I could go in deep on and provide as much value as I could. And if I didn't answer your question, it's likely that I've already covered it in depth in another YouTube video, so scroll through the channel. You can probably find an answer to your question in one of those videos below. Thank you again so much for everyone who submitted. Thank you again for everyone who stuck around this long. And if you stuck around this long, don't miss out on the upcoming lecture series on making conjugate work for raw powerlifting. We're going to go really in depth into the nitty-gritty on how to program conjugate for a raw meet prep or a raw off-season to get the most out of it, so that you can have a good total and not suck at powerlifting. Peace out. Have a good rest of your day.